welcome back to Real Seekers. I'm your host, Dale, and today I have a special treat for you guys. So I have a special guest. Believe it or not, she reached out to me to come on the show. She's got a new book. Becca Ehrlich, welcome to the show.
Yes, thank you. Good to be here.
Awesome. Just before I get into anything, we're going to be discussing the topic of Christian minimalism, which was, I was telling Becca before we started that it was entirely new to me. I'd never heard of it until now. But before we get into that, do you mind just kind of introducing the audience as to who you are, a bit about your background, and anything you want to share, and maybe a little bit about your own faith journey as well?
Sure. So I'm a Lutheran pastor. So I talk about God pretty regularly, which is fun. And so a lot of my Christian minimalism work kind of flows naturally into what I do in ministry. It's very practical, also theoretical. Obviously, there's both the practical and theory behind it. And it's been really great to have those conversations as one who works in ministry with folks as we go through it, because I'm sure we'll talk about this, but Christian minimalism is not a typical thing that people would either know exists, right, like you, Dale, or even comprehend that that would be a lifestyle that people would consider. So it's really great to have those conversations both in ministry and then just out in the world, which is also great. I actually grew up in an interfaith household. My dad is Jewish and my mom is Roman Catholic. So I have like this weird, broad worldview of having been around lots of different traditions growing up and in life. So yeah. And I'll talk more about this too, but Christian minimalism was kind of a no-brainer for me because I, as a chronically ill human being and one that got into some really bad habits around time, energy, and resource use, I discovered that this was a type of living that made the most sense to me, and I felt called by God to do it.
Gotcha. Awesome. All right. And out of curiosity, with your faith journey, did Christian apologetics or evidences play any role in your faith at all? Do you think, or is it more? I don't, just sort of curious.
Maybe a little bit. I mean, I obviously grew up in an interfaith household, and so like I was nominally Catholic, I would probably say about myself for most of my growing up years.
Yeah.
And then I sort of started owning my faith a lot more as I got older, like high school, college, and got really involved in my faith and my relationship with God at that point. So I think it was more just like owning it for myself as opposed to just being like, oh, Christianity's it. Well, like that was obvious for me. It was, you know what I mean? It was more like, oh, I'm going to actually be active in my faith as opposed to it happening to me. I'm going to actually be active in it.
Gotcha. Yeah, it's. I think for me, it was like, believe it or not, I was a late bloomer. It was after university that I started really taking it seriously and that sort of thing. So, all right, cool. So with that said, okay, Christian minimalism. Let's get into this. So, in the first place, I want to turn it over to you. As you we kind of hinted at, I had no clue what that even was until you contacted me. So, what is the Christian minimalism movement? How did you get wrapped up into that? And maybe what are some of the differences between proponents of minimalism? Because as you were telling me, there's different versions of it and that sort of thing. So yeah, why don't you tell us what it is?
Yeah, so the working definition I use for minimalism is a focus on the aspects of life that matter most and intentionally removing everything else. So basically, it's figuring out what's most important and then getting rid of anything that's keeping you from focusing on what's most important. And then Christian minimalism connects that to the Christian faith spirituality and puts Jesus at the center. So basically, that's what we're looking at. So the whole thing is about centering your life around Jesus and what's most important and intentionally living that way. So that's that. I mean, that's a very simple way to talk about it. It's very minimal. Um, and one of the things that I talk a lot about because the decluttering movement is so very trendy right now, minimalism and Christian minimalism is not about stuff. I mean, like that's a small part of it, right? Because for a lot of us, we have too much stuff and that is keeping us from focusing on what matters most. And so it makes sense to minimize some of the physical clutter in our lives, but that's not the main point of minimalism and Christian minimalism. In decluttering, it's like the whole point is just to get rid of a bunch of stuff and like you're done and that's it.
Yeah.
Whereas with minimalism and Christian minimalism, it's a lifestyle and worldview. So it's about intentional living, intentional consumption, and buying and spending, and being aware of how you're doing that and how God is calling you to do that. And that includes time, energy, resources, um, time obligations, right? Like how many of us have said yes to things because we felt obligated to do so, or because we felt like we had to, or whatever, as opposed to it actually helping us focus on the most important things in our lives. So it's a much more broader, all-encompassing lifestyle than decluttering.
Gotcha. So it's not just about decluttering, getting rid of physical things and stuff, but it's about the intentionality, like everything that we do or say or think, and that sort of thing is geared towards being conducive towards what's ultimately important, like living the Christian fundamentals or something like that. Okay,
Exactly. Exactly. Yep.
interesting. I'm learning. So, um, all right.
It's all good. It's all good.
And out of curiosity, I also asked you like how did you get wrapped up in this movement? Like, what's your personal background with it?
Yeah, so the very short version is I was having a bad health day with my chronic illness. And when I do that, I usually hang out on the couch and watch Netflix. And I watch a lot of documentaries, and it suggested the original minimalism documentary that's put out by the Minimalists. And I had no idea what minimalism was. I'd never heard of it before. But I was like, well, it's an hour and 15 minutes. So if it's terrible, I only wasted an hour and 15 minutes, you know?
Yeah.
So I put it on, and yeah, and I put it on, and like the opposite happened. I was like, oh my gosh, I think God is calling me to live more minimally. And so my husband got home from runs, and I was like, you gotta watch this. And he was like, ugh. He was not he was not excited about it at first. Yeah. I think because he realized like it was going to cause change, and change is scary.
Yeah.
And so we watched it together, and he was like, I think you're right. Like I think this is something God is calling us to do. The second time I watched it, I noticed a lot more that they kept talking about meaning in life. And so the implication being that like living simply and focusing on what matters most will help you find meaning in life. So for like Christians, we know what meaning is. It's Jesus. And so I was like, oh my gosh, this is like so connected to what Jesus teaches. I wonder what people are doing with the intersection between minimalism and Christianity. And this was the end of 2017. And quite frankly, there wasn't a lot of that. There was like an article here or like a blog entry there, like maybe a YouTube video here or there, but like there wasn't anything in great depth. And so I was like, well, I can't be the only one that's interested in this. So, and I was working on my doctorate in Christian spirituality at the time, and this sort of connected with it. And so I was like, well, why don't I start a blog, and maybe people will find it and it'll help them on their own spiritual journeys. And yeah, so that's how this kind of about. I've been writing about it more than a year and a half, 3.5 years. I've been writing about this. And then about 2 years in, I started working on the book. And so that's how all of that sort of came about.
Gotcha. And take a moment to plug the book for if people want to buy it or take a look at it and check it out. Like, what's it called? Where can they find that and stuff?
Yeah, sure. It's Christian Minimalism: Simple Steps for Abundant Living. And it's pretty much available where books are sold. There's also an ebook. You can get the Kindle version, which is great if you want to not add to your physical clutter.
Awesome. All right, cool. And I'll provide a link for the audience as well on my blog page so they from Amazon so they can click on that.
Perfect.
Okay. So great. So now we have a sense of what Christian minimalism is, and how you personally got wrapped up in it and that sort of thing. And I'm just sort of curious, how has living the Christian minimalist life impacted on your own faith journey, both the positive and if there's any negative stuff that came up that you had to overcome and that sort of thing. So, yeah, do you mind sharing
Yeah.
that?
Yeah. So the best part is when you make space, right? So not just physical space, but mental, emotional, spiritual space, and you minimize to what's most important, you realize that you actually have more space for God. And so I'm much more aware of God's presence and God's guidance than I was before. because the more we listen for God's voice, the more we get used to listening for God. And I also just naturally spend more time on like devotions and prayer and Bible reading, because quite frankly, before it was like something I shoved in between other things. I think a lot of us can relate to that. We're like, oh, I have 5 minutes here, I'll do a Bible reading real quick.
Like a chore or
And
something.
now it's like, exactly. And now it's like I have the space for it, like because I've pared down my time and resource use. I'm like, oh, I have like 30 minutes right now. I think I'll do some devotions, you know? So it's definitely been a huge impact on my spiritual life and my relationship with God. Um, the one thing I will say, the negative impact, this is really something that people don't talk about. I wish they talked about it more. Um, Starting the minimal and Christian minimalism, me, it's it's way more emotional than I thought it was going to be. And it's because you have to, what's the word I want? You basically have to confront why you accumulated this not great stuff in your life in the first place. And
Gotcha.
that's not fun.
Yeah.
Right? Like you're basically looking at all the stuff that all the dark side of you, you know, like that you
Yeah.
just don't want to focus on about yourself.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um, yeah, and so like that's why in my book I did a chapter on like confessing and sin forgiveness, because I think like the first step is like owning the fact that like I did stuff that wasn't great.
Yeah. I think all of us do that, right? We all have stuff that
Yep.
we wish we could change for sure. So yeah. Okay.
Yep. And obviously, and you know, the word repent means to turn around and go a different path, basically. So that's basically what Christian minimalism is like being like, you know what, this path not working for me, not what God's calling me to do. I'm gonna go on this path.
Yeah, exactly. All right, cool. Yeah, that's interesting. I realized I asked the questions. This was supposed to be where I asked you about the book and how this led up to that. So I don't know. Is there anything else? I know I already asked you about the book, but is there anything else in terms of how you sort of adopted the minimalist lifestyle and went through this? Is there anything that you haven't shared that led up to you writing the book that you want to share?
It's mostly the book made sense to write after I'd been writing on my blog for a while. If that makes sense. Like I was like, okay, I think I'm ready to like put this concept and topic in book form, because I know that not blogs are not everyone's cup of tea, you know, and writing a blog is very different than writing a book. So obviously I have some similar themes and things in my book, or pieces here and there of what's on my blog, but blog writing is much more concise.
Yeah, yeah.
And book writing is more long form.
You got to expand and stuff like that. Yeah, I heard in some of your other interviews though, like you had a devil of the time. Like the publishing process is not the funnest. Um, sorry, Al.
That's okay.
All right.
Yeah, traditional publishing is just an interesting animal now in this era. And I haven't made a secret of that. It's especially with nonfiction, it's really hard to get a book published traditionally now. As a nonfiction writer, they really look for like a huge social media platform and like a sure deal, basically. And so just trying to, you know, write book proposals and query letters and just being like, yo, this is a really good topic. I promise people want to read this. I think that's why a lot of nonfiction writers end up self-publishing, just because it's just tough to get in the door.
Gotcha. All right, cool. So my next question, and I think this is a really important one. So kind of apart from biblical considerations, what is the Christian minimalist lifestyle, or just the secular minimalist lifestyle? Is that something that you feel is optional for people? Like it's optional if you want to adopt it, or is it necessary for everyone? And what are some of the main arguments or reasons for adopting the minimalist lifestyle versus some of the main arguments you've encountered against that kind of lifestyle?
Yeah, I think that's great. I think everyone could benefit from living a more minimal lifestyle. I don't think everyone may want to use the label minimalist, and that's totally fine. But I think as at least in Western society, we tend to be more consumer oriented. And I think it's been to the detriment of our well-being. so I would argue, even if you're not living as a minimalist per se, living more intentionally and living a little bit more minimally, I think is something that can benefit not only yourself, other people, because you're more able to be more generous
Mhm.
when you're spending less money and less resources. So something to think about there. Um, I think also there's this idea that more is always better that is pushed in our consumer culture because it benefits, businesses and things like that. But that's not always the case. In fact, less is sometimes better, if not always better.
Mhm.
And so making sure that we're not just living the lifestyle on automatic pilot because that's just how we've always lived with consumer culture.
Gotcha.
Um, yeah, yeah. And so here's some of the main reasons I live as a Christian minimalist. So as I talked about before, minimalism tries to cut through the clutter to focus on what matters most. So you do that by identifying what's important, intentionally removing everything else, and then minimizing, and you can use the word decluttering if you want, getting rid of stuff, time commitments, bad habits, things like that. Plus intentional consumption of goods, time, energy, money. And then all of that is to have more freedom of time, energy, and financial resources to focus on what's most important. And it's at its core, and we've talked about this a little bit already, it's about intentional living rather than living on autopilot just because it's how we've internalized consumer culture or it's how we're expected to live. So it really is countercultural to what is expected of us in Western consumer society.
Yeah.
So some reasons against that I've heard from folks. Honestly, living on a pilot can be easier.
Okay.
It's
That
just
makes
easier, right?
Mhm.
Um, the argument that you hear in church culture a lot is we've always done it this way,
Okay. Yep. I've heard that.
right?
Yeah.
And that doesn't necessarily mean that's the best way to do it,
So
but it's
tradition.
definitely the easiest way because we're used to it.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Appeal to tradition is quite common. All right. Cool.
Yep.
Yep.
Yep. And living consumer culture as a typical consumer is also easier. Living counterculturally is harder. Especially people are like, why are you being so weird? Or, at worst, I actually was called unpatriotic at one point because I wasn't spending money to serve my country's capitalism, which I
Mhm.
thought was really kind of fascinating. And I was like, well, it's not that I'm not spending money. I'm just intentional with how I spend money, right? Like, it's like I don't buy things. I have to buy things to live. I'm just much more intentional about how I do it as opposed to just spending willy-nilly and not necessarily thinking about how I'm using my God-given resources.
Yeah.
So, and also like, and we kind of talked about this, myths around minimalism abound. Like people think that it's about not owning stuff or like owning as little stuff as possible, or I don't know, there's just a lot of misinformation around there about what minimalism actually is. And so it's it's not about living a very specific life. It's prescriptive rather than restrictive. So there's like a wide range of minimalists. It's not about not owning stuff or living a joyless or boring life. It's about being intentional with what we own and buy and consume and how we use our time, energy, and resources. So we do have a more exciting and joy-filled life that I would argue is the abundant life Jesus calls us to live in John 10:10.
Gotcha. Oh, you just darn you took the words out of my mouth. I was gonna say one objection I could have heard people saying is, yeah, you would live. It takes the joy out of life. Like you can't spend on like extras, like going to an amusement park or going on vacation or something like that. So, but you kind of already addressed that. That's not necessarily the case. You can spend not just on stuff you need, but on stuff that brings joy and that sort of thing as
Yeah.
well. Okay.
Yep. I take vacations. I just want to say, as a
Gee,
minimalist.
well, that's not fair. I don't go on vacations. What the heck? I should be
Well, I
home.
do when I can.
Yeah, okay. Good stuff. Um, okay. One thing, just sort of getting into this. So I heard you mention when I was researching about your story and that sort of thing and how you got into this. You mentioned you had sort of times in your life where you had both a crisis of faith and that you almost, I think you said you had like an addiction to like online shopping or something. You had to do it every like 3 days or something like that. I don't know if I heard that properly, but yeah, do you maybe want to explain like, yeah, those aspects to you, that you went through, and do you think that those kinds of problems in your personal life, as well as like problems with consumerism in general, played a role as to why you found minimalism so persuasive when you first encountered it?
Yeah, I think the big thing for me was when I discovered minimalism, I was at a point in life where I was ready to consider a complete lifestyle shift. I think a lot of times when people hear about it, they're like, oh, I can see like including some aspects of this in my life, but I'm not ready to like do a complete overhaul of how my life works,
Yeah,
which is totally valid. And I think even if you're not ready to like jump in full tilt, like you can still experiment and try living with less in different ways that you feel comfortable with to start. Like there's no right way to go about this. It's basically just a way to live more minimally and simply, in a way that I think Jesus is calling us to. So it made sense for me at that point because I had fallen into some really bad habits and into online shopping addiction, and I don't use that word lightly. I have friends who battle with substance abuse addiction, but it really is the same cycle if you think about it. You know, I get a rush when I hit the button to buy the thing, and then I'd get another rush when it showed up in the mail.
mhm,
And then, a few days later, that rush is gone, and you have to go buy something else to get it again. And we don't really talk about addiction to other things besides substances in our culture. But our society is built to encourage addiction in a lot of ways. My favorite example of this is like streaming or YouTube. When you watch, it's built to go right to the next thing.
yeah, yeah.
Um, and and it's encouraging you to get addicted and continue watching. We call it binge watching, like you know,
It's a name for it.
right. And so people end up being addicted to a lot of things because that's just how our society is built. And we have that tendency, obviously, as human beings to um, get addicted to things because we're sinful. And so it made sense to me in that moment where I was like, oh my gosh, I'm addicted to this and I need to break out of this. And so in addition to starting to live more minimally, I also did a year-long shopping fast to break myself of the habits. And before everyone freaks out, I did buy food. I
Yeah.
did buy medicine, I did buy toiletries, but I only bought toiletries when I ran out. And I had an approved list of things I could buy. Like I was in school doing a degree, so I could buy books, for example. But I did not buy anything that wasn't on the approved list, except one thing. We moved to Philadelphia
Ah,
during that year, and we moved into a 3-floor house because they build up and not out. And
okay.
I couldn't carry my laundry 3 floors. So I bought a $10 laundry bag, which was technically not on the list, but I can tell you it adds value to my life immensely every time I do laundry.
Definitely. Yeah. Awesome. All right. Yeah, I think that is a great point for the audience, and especially Christians in the audience as well, where we are to be mindful of everything that we do and say, and that sort of thing. And you can get addicted to anything. All good things could be perverted and be
Yep.
misused or something like that. So yeah, that's a great point there, I think. Okay, one question I have for you though is, okay, great. So you've been talking about Christian minimalism, giving us sort of an idea as to how it fit into your life and how it worked for you. But people are different. They're in different circumstances. They different needs, different blah blah blah. So like, is Christian minimalism and or just minimalism in general able to accommodate differing circumstances or different types of people? Are there different ways to implement the minimalist lifestyle?
Yeah, 100%. So there are people who live the minimalist lifestyle who only own things that can all fit in one suitcase and live as nomads. On the other end of the spectrum, there are people who own a house and have 2 cars. And that's totally fine. The common thread is focusing on what matters most, getting rid of the stuff that doesn't serve what matters most, and intentionally living, and if you're Christian, obviously Jesus at the center. So as long as that's what's driving you to live the life Jesus is calling you to live, like how you live that out is going to look very different depending on context. Like, for example, a single person living as a minimalist is going to look different than a couple with 3 kids. It just is. And that's totally fine. And so there's no right way to live as a minimalist or a Christian minimalist. It's all about finding the way you're being called to specifically to live more minimally.
Gotcha. Awesome. So yeah, it's not a one size fits all. That was one of the immediate concerns I had, and I wanted to look into that. So I was glad to figure out, yeah, that there's obviously flexibility in how it is implemented and that sort of thing. Okay. So far we've kind of been, hey, we're Christian. We're arguing for Christian. You're arguing for Christian minimalism, and we've totally put to the side the Bible or the biblical basis and that sort of thing. So yeah, at this point, I wanted to kind of turn it over to you and ask, well, what exactly is the biblical basis for Christian minimalism? Are we commanded in the Bible to be minimalist, in your opinion? Yeah, what kind of justifies that biblically?
Yeah, there's a lot. So I would argue that Jesus calls and invites us to live a more minimal lifestyle, because I really truly believe that Jesus lived as a minimalist, and we're called to have the mind of Christ, right? Philippians 2:5. So we're called to emulate Jesus and live as he did as much as we can. Obviously, different time periods, and we're not God, but
Yeah.
and like, for example, oh, go ahead.
No, I was just agreeing. I was saying, yeah, I'm not God, definitely. I'll agree.
Right, obviously. But for example, like Jesus lived a simple life and encouraged his disciples to live simply too. So like, for example, when they traveled, they stayed at other people's homes. They didn't take much with them. And he told the disciples to do that as well. So like Mark 10:10, Luke 10:4. And in fact, we find out like Jesus didn't even have a home in Matthew 8:2. And this is one of my favorites. Jesus distilled all the laws and commandments down to the 2 most important: love God and love your neighbor as yourself. So Matthew 22:37-40. And I feel like that's pretty minimalist, like taking, over 600 laws that existed at the time and being like, actually pare them down to these 2, which I think is great.
Yeah. Go ahead.
Go ahead.
No, I was just gonna add it. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, that was common Jewish practice to kind of summarize all of the Torah as those 2 commandments, kind of thing: love your God and love your neighbors. But yeah, go ahead. I didn't mean to interrupt.
No, that's okay. I just want to make sure that you can break in if you want to.
Okay.
And also in Paul's letter to the Philippians, it says that Jesus emptied himself, taking the form of a servant. And I love that image, that whole consist idea that like Jesus emptied himself. And so talking about Christian minimalism as this emptying, this purgation in Christian spirituality of, getting rid of that which keeps us from God. And the idea, Jesus talked about our identity as beloved children of God, and not chasing fame, status, wealth, or power. So like, for example, there's so many times in all the gospels where the disciples are arguing about who the greatest is, including in Luke 22, like they were arguing about it at the Last Supper, which is crazy to me. But
yeah.
And obviously we're not arguing, like physically arguing with each other about who the greatest is, but we try to like one up each other, like keeping up with the Joneses, that sort of stuff. And every time Jesus is like, no, this is not what this is about. Like, I came to serve, not be served.
One thing that I just thought of in terms of possible biblical support, that I used to have a skeptical co-host, and he would kind of contort some Bible verses to say that he would say, well, the Bible argues for Christian minimalism. He didn't use that word, but to the max, because he'll point to Jesus telling people, sell all of your possessions, get rid of everything. And he says that's a command for everybody universally and that sort of thing for all time. You have the example of the early church where, everyone seems to be selling all of their goods and living communally, almost as like communists or something like that. So what would you say to like a skeptic who might say, well, I'm sorry, Christian minimalism isn't what you say it is. You've got to take it to the max. You've got to get rid of everything, declutter everything. And, strip everything down. Are they proper with these Bible verses or not?
I think that would be their personal calling for to live that way, because I would argue that God was very specific in which people were called to live that way, right? Like that's how the early Christians in that community context were called to live. Not everyone is called to live in a Christian commune and have everything in common. If you are, that's fantastic. I'm not. I don't think you are, Dale.
No, definitely not.
Right? So, or like, I use the example of the rich young man, right, in the three different gospels where he comes up to Jesus and is like, yo, I did all the things. I do all the things perfectly, which, I could argue probably not, because we're all sinful and fall short of the glory of God. But that's another
Mhm.
conversation. And Jesus is like, okay, cool. Like, why don't you sell all your stuff and then come follow me? And the guy decides, rather than doing that, to go back to his life. And that's a choice, but he missed out on like experiencing Jesus's ministry in person because he wasn't feeling like he could leave the comforts of the material and wealthy comforts he had. So I mean, I don't think Jesus would come up to everyone and be like, yo, sell all your stuff and come follow me. I think that was specifically for that guy, because he was like, okay, you're ready for the next challenge, here you go.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. I agree 100% with you, obviously. I think that they're kind of taking those verses out of context. First of all, it was given to that rich man, for example, individually, because Jesus knew his heart. And he's giving us an object lesson that, look, you need to be willing. You have to have your priorities straight for God and advancing God's kingdom. So I think you should be willing, if needed, to give up all worldly stuff, but obviously, that's not needed for the vast majority of people. Jesus knew that guy, what was in his heart, and that he didn't have his priorities on God, and that's why he said that to him. So, yeah, that was my take. But you're the guest, so I'll shut up. And what do you make of that? Is that right, or am I totally off?
No, I think that's totally accurate. And so, like, when you say that these texts are like, this is how everyone should live, you're missing the point of like, no, like Jesus calls us to specific things. Like that's why we were given specific spiritual gifts and skills. That's why in the body of Christ, like one person's the nose and one person's the hand and one person's the foot. Like if everybody was the nose, we'd be in major trouble. So
Yeah.
so it doesn't make sense that like taking a calling for some specific people in the Bible and like giving it for everyone, it just doesn't make sense to me.
Awesome. All right, cool. So I'm right. So take that, David J. and Skeptics, if you're listening.
Yes, congratulations.
Thank you. All right, so let's flip it around though. So now I'm interested in asking you about what about opponents to Christian minimalism? What are some of the biblical passages or main texts that are used to argue against living this Christian minimalist lifestyle? And yeah, what do you make of some of those?
Yeah, it's really interesting. I've never been asked that question before, but I was like super excited to talk about this.
Yeah, awesome.
It's just fun. I'm a
Yeah,
nerd. Well, one of the things you had mentioned to me before was the oil and Judas, and I think you were talking about John 12, if I'm right.
yeah.
So I would argue that that's not an anti-minimalist text at all, because the whole minimalist thing is focusing on what matters most, and like by anointing Jesus, she was like focusing on what matters most in that moment, which was Jesus.
Mhm.
And so like, and this is where I think the myths around Christian minimalism or minimalism in general do a disservice to like what this lifestyle and this worldview actually is, because like if it's adding value to your life and you're using it to focus on what matters most, like then it's good. Like you're doing what you should be doing. It's not about like not using things or not having quality things. It's about focusing on what's most important. And in that moment she was. So there's that one. It was funny because I was thinking about this. So one of the things that I talk about a lot when I talk about Christian minimalism is how it's the complete opposite of the prosperity gospel movement, which assumes that wealth and health and success are all signs of God's favor. And obviously we talked enough so far that like obviously that's the antithesis of Christian minimalism.
Yeah.
And yeah, and so there's a lot of I would argue are proof texts that people use for that type of thought process. And one of them, ironically, which I think is hilarious, is John 10:10. Like Jesus came that we may have life and have it abundantly. But it's like super clear when you start looking at Jesus's teaching that it's not about material wealth or like worldly success or fame or any of that. Like Jesus's whole point is like, no, like that's not the point of life. The whole point of life is to like worship God and love neighbor. It's not about any of that. And so I think that's so funny that like that's one of the proof texts for for prosperity gospel, because I'm like, Jesus's abundant life is not consumer culture's abundant life. And I really think that prosperity gospel kind of I don't know, it's this awful marriage of consumer culture and bad theology.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's great. Yeah, I agree 100% with you on the prosperity gospel and that sort of thing. And also on the oil things. That was another example that I got pushback on, saying like, oh well, you can't waste anything. Like if you don't eat all of your food, you should be shipping that off. There are people starving. Ship that off to Africa or something. And I'm just like, this is ridiculous. And I use the example of Jesus and Judas and the oil there, where Judas is like, what are you doing? You're wasting that. Sell it, make money, and give it to the poor. That's our priority type thing. You're missing the whole point, right? You're allowed to have, to enjoy, and that sort of thing. She was putting Jesus first. So yeah, I think your answer was great on that front. Awesome. Okay. The next question then. Okay, so great. So now we have a sort of a biblical foundation or an idea of some of the biblical arguments for and against. Great. So let's pretend you sold people in my audience or sold me and that sort of thing. I'm going to become a Christian minimalist. So what sort of practical advice would you give to any Christians who are looking to adopt this minimalist lifestyle? Maybe give your story as to how you got started and what steps you took to get where you are today.
Yeah, and a lot of it, I'll be honest, a lot of it was trial and error for us because I don't think everything will work for everyone. Especially, like I said, like every context is kind of different for each person, and we all have different ways of thinking through things. But I will say that starting small was the best way for us. So for us, physical clutter was one of the major issues we had. That's not always the case for everybody. For us, that was we were swimming and stuff. And so we started really small, like 15 minutes a day, we would clean out a drawer a day. And the best part about that was we were done pretty fast and you could start seeing results pretty quickly. And so that helped drive us to continue to do it. Because honestly, like minimizing your life is not super glamorous because you have to confront all the physical, emotional, spiritual clutter that you have and do something with it. So what really drove us was that why for us. And obviously the big why is like to focus on what matters most, but like finding our own personal why was the most helpful for us. And for us, that was like, I want more time with God and family. That was our big thing. And so that was what kept us going when it got tough and when we had to confront that stuff about ourselves that we were not super happy about. So finding that personal why and starting small is really helpful. It may not be stuff for you or your listeners. It might be your schedule is so full and you want to free yourself so that you can focus more on something, with your personal why. And so finding what is super cluttered in your life and keeping you from focusing on what matters most. And obviously figuring out what matters most. I suggest obviously things in my book, but for most people, relationships is one of those things. Obviously God, stewardship, using resources wisely in the name of God, all those things, vocation, living out your calling that God is giving you, and service, serving others, which is obviously a huge part of Christians. So making sure that you are focusing on what's most important and finding ways to do that that makes sense in your life. So for example, like since I had fallen into online shopping addiction and spending habits, my husband and I sat down and made a budget, which sounds super old school, but we used an app, so it's not quite as old school, I suppose. We gave it a tech twist. But the great part is like the app helps show you in categories how you're using your money. And quite frankly, like that gives us our priorities of how we were using our resources and realizing like we were not using our resources as wisely as we could be. And so some practical ways to do that is doing that, paring down your schedule, like being okay with saying no, which is hard, I think, especially for church people, because we're like, I don't know, like internalized that we have to say yes to all the things, and like that's not the case. You don't have to. If it's not helping you focus on what matters most and helping you share your gifts in a way that's helpful, like you can say no. It's okay,
Mm,
because otherwise you're just frustrated and heading for burnout because you're not using your time and energy wisely. So things like that.
gotcha. All right, cool. Yeah, yeah. I think that was great. Giving sort of the example, physical, spiritual, and emotional clutter. It's not just about decluttering. So I just want to reemphasize that for the audience. Okay. Well, believe it or not, that's it for my list of questions. Let me turn it over to you. Is there anything important that I've neglected to ask about, or that you think is really important about Christian minimalism that just because I'm new to the movement, I didn't think to ask about? Yeah, what would you like to raise, or what's important to raise and speak about?
One of the things I love talking about is how this is a lifestyle and world that can work for all flavor of Christianity. Because I think, I don't know, I think people make assumptions about like what type of Christian you have to be in order to live this type of lifestyle. And we have a Christian minimalism Facebook group, and it's just under 1,000 people. It's the page, so it's a smaller group, and we talk about it in more depth, and people can have conversations and post questions and get advice from folks that are also on this journey together. And we have from like evangelicals all the way to Roman Catholic and Orthodox and everything in between. And so one of my favorite stories about this is I think it was a Roman Catholic posted, hey, I want to connect Lent and my giving up thing for Lent with Christian minimalism and living a more Christian minimalist lifestyle. Like, how are people doing that this year? And people were like, what's Lent? Because that's not a tradition for every Christian, you know? And so it was like this really great conversation across denominational lines where people were like, oh, it's like this in the liturgical versions of Christianity where, you know, you repent and turn back to God. And like a lot of times there's this tradition of giving up stuff and fasting. And people were like, oh, that's really cool. I didn't know that. And it was just this really cool, like cross-pollination of different Christians. And so I just always try to remind people that like this is for anyone who wants to live more minimally and focus on what matters most, including Jesus.
Oh, that's pretty crazy. I didn't even think that like how it would work across denominations, or that there might be some some denominations might have more hurdles or something like that. Do you, out of curiosity, do you find that certain denominations are more resistant or have more theological objections to Christian minimalism compared to others? And I don't know if you want to like, what would those be? Um,
Oh, that's a great question that no one has asked me before.
I'm just,
um, I think, oh, go ahead.
no, I was just saying, no, I'm just curious. I'm just curious. This is the way my mind works. So yeah, go for it. Answer. I'm curious as to the answer.
Yeah, it's so funny. I don't think there's any specifically that put up hurdles, but I think that certain cultural things in different versions of Christianity um, tend to push back of certain things about Christian minimalism, if that makes sense. So, like for example, in the more um, evangelical world, I found a little pushback when I talk about stockpiling
Okay.
and how like there's a difference, right, between like having a few extra of something and like buying as many that you can get and your hands on so that other people don't have access to it. What's really fascinating is I've really only gotten pushback on that with folks on the evangelical side of the spectrum. And I'm not quite sure why. Like, I think that's really interesting. Like, people in mainline Protestantism or the Roman Catholics or the Orthodox folks haven't seemed to push back as much on that concept as others. Even though it's super biblical, right? Like Luke 12, Jesus is like, yo, you stockpiled a bunch of stuff and you're gonna die. Where's all going? Not to you. So this is what happens when you focus on stockpiling stuff and not God, you know? So it's just been really interesting with that specific topic. Like, I've gotten more pushback from folks in that more denominational, like more non-denominational evangelical world than like other traditions. But like, in general, I think it's just interesting that there's common themes throughout Christianity for everybody. And so I think anyone who's a Christian and a follower of Jesus can be a Christian minimalist for sure, or even use aspects of that in their life if they don't want to use that label, which is fine. I don't think there's like any specific theological reasons anyone would not want to do that depending on their denomination.
Gotcha. Yeah, so it might be something culturally. I don't know, like, because I'm evangelical, guilty of charge. I'm the Baptist tradition myself, right?
Cool.
But yeah, I've never understood stockpiling personally, but I do know some people in my church when we were going through the shortages and stuff. Some people in the church were stockpiling, so I don't know what it is about that, but yeah, interesting. All right, cool. So yeah, I just want to say, yeah, thanks so much for coming on, answering my questions. This was a new topic for me, so that was great for both me and the audience to learn what is this thing. Believe it or not, under your definition, like putting your priorities straight and getting rid of clutter, I think I'm a Christian minimalist. I think I'm ready to adopt it. So congratulations on that. I was skeptical going in, so but given your definitions, I think that's absolutely right. Every Christian should be doing that. So yeah, I guess I'll turn it to you, and I'll let you get the any closing words that you want to say to the audience, or plug any blog sites or projects or anything you want to say. So yeah.
Oh, sure. Yeah.
Go
Well,
ahead.
in general, I think just living intentionally is a good way to live.
Yeah.
Which sounds super simple, but it really is. Like, I think so often we just live the way we always have, or the way people expect us to, or whatever, and we miss out on so many things that God is doing in our lives because we're not living intentionally. And so that's been a huge mind shift for me as a Christian minimalist, is like, like, I'm not made by God to sleepwalk through life. Like, that's not what I'm made to do. God wants me like fully awake and prepared. There's a lot of Bible verses about that, right? And so I want to do that, and I want to live that life. And so Christian minimalism is a great structure for me to do that. So that's a huge thing for me. You can find a lot of cool stuff about Christian minimalism. I still write on my blog regularly, christianminimalism.com. Obviously, the book is a great resource as well. Both of those things try to strike the balance between the theory and the practical aspects of living as a Christian minimalist. So there's both practical things of like some ways that you can try to implement some of this, but then also like, why are we doing this in the first place? What is this about? I talked about the Christian Minimalism Facebook group. It's called Christian Minimalism Community, and it's also attached to the Christian Minimalism Facebook page, which is the wider folks on that page. And then the group is a little smaller for people to talk more in depth. And then I always love talking about this. So on both Twitter and Instagram, it's at Jesus Minimalism, because ironically, Christian minimalism is too many characters. So I had to minimize the name to Jesus Minimalism for both Instagram and
All right, I'll try to include the link to that. I'm not a Twitter user, so I'll try to find you and put that in for people. Uh, Go ahead. Go ahead. I interrupted. Sorry.
Oh, no, it's okay. And so those are the best ways to connect with Christian minimalism stuff. I hope that this helps people live more simply and connect to what God is calling them to do in their lives. And focus on what's most important. That's really what I'm trying to do.
Awesome. Awesome. All right. Well, yeah, I think that says it all. So yeah, once again, thank you so much for coming on and reaching out to me to be on the show, and have a great week, everybody. All right. Bye-bye.